problema di oggi. The preface to the phenomenology is generally thought to be the direct occasion of an open breach between Hegel and Schelling, and that is not a view from which I wish to dissent. But I do not think that Hegel meant to cause a breach. He had been trying for about 3 years to insist on a crucial distinction between Schelling and his school. And it is evident that he still wanted to maintain this distinction in the letter that he sent with Schelling's copy of the Phenomenology. So we must examine the polemics against formalism in the philosophy of nature in the preface to the Phenomenology with some care, instead of simply assuming, as so many do, that they form the opening salvo of the attack upon Schelling that becomes fully explicit in the lecture courses of the Berlin years. Let us begin with the famous remark about the dark night in which all the cows are black. This jibe did not originate with Hegel, and if he meant it, as even the cautious editors of the critical edition do not hesitate to affirm, if he meant it as a direct attack on Schelling's identity philosophy, then he has changed sides suddenly and dramatically in a battle that has been going on since 1802. It is truly an astounding piece of effrontery in that case when he writes to Schelling, "In the preface, you will not find that I have gone too far against the stupidity that makes so much mischief with your formulas and degrades your science into a cold formalism." For how can it not be going too far if Hegel is not... How can it not be going too far if Hegel is now joining in the chorus of the Jena wits and repeating a sarcastic comment that has gone the rounds of the academic tea tables at Jena for several years during which Hegel was satirized himself as Schelling's stout warrior and regarded as a sort of echo in which the absolute identity became even more obscure, a dark night in which the cows were even blacker than Schelling made them. Yet the letter in which this outrage upon all decency and friendship is supposedly perpetrated comes in the even flow of a series of friendly exchanges about the projects of the two friends, including Schelling's latest publications regarding the philosophy of nature. See especially letter 82, the 3rd of January 1807. Hegel wrote this letter and carried on the succeeding correspondence, letters 83, 90 and 93, while he was writing the preface. You see what an incredible thing it is we're asked to believe. What Hegel refers to in his letter of the 1st of May 1807, the letter I've actually quoted, is a policy that he has been following for some time. Ever since October 1804, to be precise, Hegel has been publicly making a distinction between Schelling as a creative genius for whose work he has the greatest respect and the nature philosophy that makes mischief with the terminology of Schelling. That's a quotation from the lecture which I have dated to October 1804, or I claim to have dated to October 1804. Making a distinction between Schelling as a creative genius for whose work he has the greatest respect and the nature philosophy that makes mischief with the terminology of Schelling. You see how similar the language is to the letter of 1807. Schelling is no formalist. Hegel said in that lecture, because he has never been a prisoner of his terminology, but has always been on the move. But Schelling's school is doing what scholastics have always done, reducing his genial insights into formulas from which a system could be mechanically manufactured. This claim does involve a serious criticism of Schelling himself, for it implies that Schelling has no proper method, or at least that he has not managed to make any non-formal method explicit. The best reading that we can give to Hegel's expressed admiration for Schelling, and all of the evidence except the controversial Vorrede, the preface, strongly indicates that we ought to give it the best reading that we can. The best reading that we can give is to interpret it as claiming that Schelling is not really an intellectual gypsy, although he does rather look like one, changing his mind every year and issuing a new statement of his system, conducting his education in public, as Hegel said later in his lectures on the history of philosophy. Schelling's work is bound to continue to look like that until someone succeeds in exposing the rationale of his wandering progress. That is what Hegel wanted Schelling to see in the phenomenology, a methodical approach to the absolute identity of nature and spirit. But if that is the overall context of Hegel's phenomenology project in its relation to Schelling's philosophy of nature, then what is Hegel trying to do with Friedrich Schlegel's quip? It was Friedrich Schlegel who originated it, as far as I can discover, as far as anyone can discover. Friedrich Schlegel's quip about the night in which all the cats are grey. Hegel liked and admired Jean-Paul, who said in his printed course on aesthetics that the absolute, that's 1804, that the absolute identity was the night in which all differences are black. But Hegel's feelings towards Friedrich Schlegel were never friendly, for he must have known that Schlegel regarded him and his work with scathing contempt. See especially his letter to his brother of the 20th of March, that's Friedrich Schlegel's letter to his brother of the 20th of March 1804. Hegel's public expression of admiration for Jean-Paul is in Glauben und Wissen. Hegel would have been more directly aware of A.W. Schlegel's feelings because Schelling was in direct correspondence with him, and it must be admitted that Hegel probably nourished a secret resentment against Schelling for tending to agree with the Schlegel's low estimate of him. But this resentment is expressed in his own intellectual gypsy image of Schelling. This image, which is implicit in the laudatory remarks of the lecture of 1804, probably became explicit in Hegel's first course on the history of philosophy in 1805. For I feel sure that the comment Schelling has conducted his philosophical education in public comes from the Jena Heft. It harmonizes perfectly with the defense of Schelling against the Unfug of his disciples, the mischief caused by his disciples, in 1804. Hegel's own resentful energy is devoted to proving that he is different. He, Hegel, is a different kind of follower because he can provide Schelling with what is really needed. He's not just a follower. But then, what is Hegel trying to do? It's in the last degree unlikely, anyway, that he is now publicly supporting what Schlegel had said only in personal conversations. Now, it can, I think, be shown in other cases that when Hegel borrows someone else's joke, he does something new with it. Often, he does quite the opposite of what is expected, and that is the case here. The general context of the passage is the first of two attacks on formalism contained in the preface. I cannot quote everything relevant in full, but I hope that that is not necessary. In brief, the argument is as follows. Formalism is a disease that comes upon speculative science because science ought to be universally accessible and intelligible, but it is not. Formalism produces a dead substitute for scientific knowledge, a substitute which is easily intelligible, but which has lost its speculative significance. Science, when it first appears, seems paradoxical. It has not solved the problem of presenting itself to the unscientific consciousness with the obviousness which the age of reason requires of all that is rational. But that is not a proper ground of complaint against it. Now, there's a quotation in German which Riccardo will kindly read for us.
Siamo a pagina 5, no, e adesso c'è questa citazione tedesca.
Die Wissenschaft, die erst beginnt.
Io posso leggere De Negri, è molto noto comunque, è il paragrafo 14, De Negri ha i paragrafi a fianco del testo. E fa così: la scienza che, essendo agli inizi, non è ancora giunta né alla compiutezza del dettaglio né alla perfezione della forma, potrà sentirsi rimproverare una simile deficienza. Ma se il biasimo dovesse toccare l'essenza stessa della scienza, esso sarebbe allora tanto ingiusto quanto sconveniente non voler riconoscere l'esigenza di quel perfezionamento.
Thank you. On the one side, we shall have a longer quotation in a minute, but now we have just a summing up. On the one side, continues Hegel, there is the party of the understanding with a great mass of readily understandable doctrines. On the other side, there is a party which despises understandability and prides itself upon immediate rationality and divinity. This latter group may seem to win the day, but that is half because the partisans of the understanding are too bored to argue. The other half of the apparent victory is genuine, because although the partisans of understanding have a great mass of knowledge organized in familiar ways, and a technique of fixing upon remarkable and curious novelties which makes it seem as if they have control of the divine party's knowledge too, the truth is that they can only apply the same logical formula to everything. The logical method of this party of the understanding is what Hegel stigmatizes as a monochrome formalism. It is, and here I shall read the German before we have the Italian, die gestaltlose Wiederholung des einen und desselben, das nur an das verschiedene Material äußerlich angewendet ist und einen langweiligen Schein der Verschiedenheit erhält. Can you find that for us? That's
should be just afterwards.
Yeah. It'll be paragraph 15, I think. Because it's 16.
15. Also.
Die gestaltlose Wiederholung.
Sì.
The next pair.
Ma io ho trovato quel procedere alla fine, quel procedere adesso è un formalismo monocromatico che dice la differenza del contenuto soltanto perché questa è di già preparata e di già nota.
Gestaltlose should be in italics. I think. Or perhaps it's not. Perhaps I underlined it.
Einfach der Formalismus l'abbiamo trovato. L'ho trovato, sì. Tale dispiegamento è invece la ripetizione dell'identico priva di ogni figura. Poi c'è questo unum atque quidem, viene poi soltanto estrinsecamente applicato a diversi materiali e riceve così una tediosa parvenza di diversità. Se lo sviluppo non consiste in altro che in tale ripetizione della medesima formula, l'idea per sé indubbiamente vera, nel fatto non va più in là del proprio cominciamento.
The next paragraph, here you have to have a long quotation. The next paragraph moves from the visual monochrome metaphor to the auditory one of monotony, but the target is the same. Dabei behauptet diese Eintönigkeit. I think it's probably the beginning of the paragraph and it runs all the way through. 16. Chances are.
Sì. Ancora, tale formalismo vuol gabellare questa monotonia e l'universalità astratta per l'assoluto. Il formalismo protesta che sentirsi inappagati nell'universalità da lui proposta è incapacità a impadronirsi di una posizione assoluta e a mantenervisi. Se un tempo la vuota possibilità di rappresentarsi in modo diverso qualche cosa bastava confutarne una rappresentazione, e se la mera possibilità, ossia il pensiero generico, aveva tutto il positivo valore del conoscere effettuale, similmente noi vediamo ora attribuirsi ogni valore a universale idea in questa forma della irrealtà, ed assistiamo al dissolvimento di tutto ciò che è differenziato e determinato, o assistiamo piuttosto al precipitare di questi valori nell'abisso della vacuità, senza che questo atto sia conseguenza di uno sviluppo né si giustifichi in se stesso, il che dovrebbe tenere il posto della considerazione speculativa. La considerazione della determinatezza di qualsivoglia esserci, come si dà nell'assoluto, si riduce al dichiarare che se ne è bensì parlato come di un alcunché, ma che peraltro nell'assoluto, nello A uguale ad A, non ci sono certe possibilità perché lì tutto è uno. Contrapporre la coscienza distinta e compiuta, contrapporre la conoscenza distinta e compiuta, o alla conoscenza che sta cercando ed esigendo il proprio compimento, questa razza di sapere, che cioè nell'assoluto tutto è uguale, oppure gabellare un suo assoluto per la notte nella quale, come si suol dire, tutte le vacche sono nere, tutto ciò è l'ingenuità di una conoscenza fatua. Finché la conoscenza dell'effettualità assoluta non sia venuta completamente in chiaro circa la propria natura, dalla scienza non disparirà quel formalismo che, accusato e spregiato dalla filosofia dei tempi nuovi, si è riprodotto proprio in essa, né disparirà quando anche ne sia nota e sentita l'insufficienza. Considerando che una rappresentazione generale fatta precedere al tentativo di una sua dettagliata realizzazione può essere d'aiuto a comprendere la realizzazione stessa, sarà utile accennare qui preliminarmente qualcuno dei suoi aspetti nell'intento anche di rinnovare alcune forme, l'uso delle quali costituisce un ostacolo al conoscere filosofico. Ho letto? ho letto un po' di più.
Sì. This argument is the climax of Hegel's justification for the offering of a preliminary Vorstellung of his attempt to build a bridge between the natural self-consciousness and scientific cognition. I'm trying to identify the function of that polemic, you see. And it comes as the preamble to the preliminary Vorstellung, the picture of what he's going to do in the phenomenology. He returns to the formalism that has begotten itself again in the philosophy of the more recent time after presenting that sketch. The two attacks on formalism bracket the sketch of what he's going to do. And when he returns to formalism, we learn that the newest formalism is not just the monotonous formalism, the monochrome formalism, that is already condemned in this first attack as the naivete of the void in cognition. The reborn formalism is not initially monochromatic, but bichromatic. It becomes monochrome again only in its perfected form. This is somewhere about paragraph 53.
53.
Something like that. It'll begin the instrument, das Instrument. Dieses gleich Techniken Formalismus. The instrument of this.
Fantastico, bravo Bis. Cinquantuno.
51? Ah.
Di dove? Pagina 51 o... Ah. Il dottor Visa ha un Hegel lexicon in testa, tutte occorrenze di strumenti. Leggo ancora. Lo strumento di questo monotono formalismo si maneggia così facilmente come la tavolozza di quel pittore sulla quale si trovassero soltanto due colori. Poniamo il rosso e il verde, adoperando l'uno per le scene storiche, l'altro per i paesaggi, secondo la richiesta. Sarebbe difficile decidere quale sia più grande, se la comodità con cui tutto ciò che è in cielo, sulla e sotto la terra viene cosparso di quell'acquetta colorata, o l'orgoglio di aver trovato una chiave buona per tutti gli usci. L'una serve di appoggio all'altro. Il risultato di questo metodo consiste nel catalogare tutto, incollando a tutto ciò che v'è in cielo e in terra, a tutte le formazioni della natura e dello spirito, quella coppia di determinazione dello schema universale. E non è da meno di un rapporto solare sull'organismo dell'universo, ovvero sia di una tabella somigliante allo scheletro coi cartellini incollati o alle file di barattoli nella drogheria con le loro etichette. Una simile tabella trascura e occulta l'essenza viva delle cose e non diviene quindi più perspicua dello scheletro da cui si sono levati sangue e carne, o dei barattoli nei quali si è potuto richiudere qualcosa di non vitale. Devo leggere ancora?
Sì, più.
Si è già sopra notato che questa maniera di conoscenza finisce in una pittura assolutamente monocromatica. Essa maniera, infatti, scandalizzata delle differenze dello schema, le affonda, perché appartenenti alla riflessione, nella vuotaggine dell'assoluto. in modo che poi ne viene fuori la pura identità, il bianco senza forma. Quel carattere monocromatico dello schema e delle sue determinazioni non vitali, di questa assoluta identità, e anche il passare dell'una cosa nell'altra, tutto è ugualmente morto intelletto, tutto è conoscenza esteriore.
See, in Hegel's own analysis of the preface for his table of contents, this bichromatic formalism is called schematizing formalism. This word schematizing directs us clearly to Kant as its point of origin. If we go back a page to paragraph 50, for those who have the text, if we go back a page to the point at which Kant's own formalism is briefly discussed, we can see clearly that in Kant's triplicität, or the tabulation of the categories as pairs of opposites which are synthetically united in the third, Kant's triplicität is the paradigm manier of the new formalist philosophy of nature. But the bichromatic character of the reborn formalism is based on the clear distinction of nature from spirit. That's why there are two colors. Thus, when Hegel says that red is needed for a historical piece and green for a landscape, he is thinking of Kant's antinomies, especially the third antinomy between determinism and freedom. It is Kant's eminence as a painter in both modes of this antinomy that enables Hegel to modulate his metaphor from natural philosophy back to formal idealism proper in the person of Fichte. Fichte needed the two colors on his palette, but he specialized strictly in historical pieces. The landscape in the background of his work was to all intents and purposes a blank. When Hegel calls the newly reborn schematic formalism in natural philosophy ein sonnenklarer Bericht über das Organismus des Universums, a sun-clear report upon the organism of the universe, he means to indicate that the latest naturphilosophy has completed Fichte's work by filling in a way appropriate to Fichte, completed Fichte's work according to Fichte's method by filling this blank. There are, therefore, several parties who are quite unambiguously alluded to in Hegel's two discussions of formalism. Only Kant receives the signal honor of being actually named in section 50. And Fichte, although not named, is unmistakably referred to as an individual because he is the author of the real Sonnenklarer Bericht, the real sun-clear report. It seems that the others belong to the shadows of history. To name or securely identify them as individuals would be an offense against the dignity of a true science of experience. They belong to the throng of those who did nothing significant, about whom Virgil instructed Dante, non ragioniam di lor ma guarde passa. This verdict is too hasty, however, for in the context of the formalist Kant and the new schematizing formalists of natural philosophy whom Kant has inspired, the author of Die Wissenschaft die erst beginnt, the science at its first beginning, the author of Die Wissenschaft die erst beginnt is unmistakably Schelling. We must suppose that Hegel himself thought that this reference was unmistakable when he wrote to Schelling about the stupidity that makes so much mischief with your forms. Schelling was himself the first reader to comment that the contrast intended was not clearly made in the text. He remarked on this in his letter of reply to Hegel's letter. Schelling must certainly have thought that he deserved to be named at least as much as Kant. But this again involves a misunderstanding, for there can be no personal names attached to Wissenschaft as such. Thus, the absence of Schelling's name sets him above Kant and not below him like the unnamed Fichte. For us, as careful readers, and even for Schelling as a careless one, the distinction is actually clear enough with respect to the first part of the polemic at least. For there is another echo in this first context which is just as unmistakable as the sun-clear report, the sonnenklare Bericht, in the second one. Sonnenklare Bericht in the second one. When Hegel says that the monochrome formalism is die gestaltlose Wiederholung des einen und desselben, das nur an das verschiedene Material äußerlich angewendet ist, the shapeless repetition of the one and the same, which is only outward, which is only externally applied to the distinct material. When he says that about the monochrome formalism, he is deliberately echoing the identity formula of Reinhold. So there's somebody else whose name we can quite definitely give. Schelling had shared in the polemic against this simple-minded identity of the understanding in the first issue of the Critical Journal of Philosophy. So he would recognize this echo just as surely as he would know that it could not be his system that was proud of its understandability but deficient in rationality and divinity. He probably would not remember the way that Hegel set up this same opposition between the poles of essence, Schwärmerei, Kontraktion, and appearance, Zerstreuung, Expansion. Hegel set up this same opposition between the poles of essence and appearance at the end of the difference essay. Schelling wouldn't remember that, I think. But he would never have supposed that even Hegel, whom he regarded as a bit obtuse, could call the repetition of his absolute identity gestaltlos, shapeless. Schelling's own objection to Hegel's terminology in the preface was precisely that the Begriff of which Hegel speaks is, properly speaking, gestaltlos. And he would have recognized certainly that the Gestalten of the phenomenology are a new version, a new variation upon the chain of Potenzen in which the absolute identity is gestalted in his system. So I do not think this passage, the first attack, the one with the dark night in it and the black cows, I do not think this passage contributed to the breach between Hegel and Schelling, of which it has always been taken as emblematic. Or at least it did not do so at the first reading. But after Schelling had read the second attack on schematizing formalism, and especially after he had heard others putting their own interpretation upon both of the polemics, I suppose that Schelling's attitude and feelings changed quickly and dramatically. Nor can we fairly blame Schelling for this, for Hegel's behavior was obtuse. To pick up the jibe of a personal enemy, Friedrich Schlegel, and turn it upon the very school to which it seems outwardly least applicable, since identity means to Reinhold and Bardili that everything is what it is and not another thing. That's Bishop Butler in the English tradition, that quotation. Identity means to Reinhold and Bardili that everything is what it is and not another thing. G.E. Moore quotes it at the beginning, on the title page, I think, of Principia Ethica. Turn it upon the very school to which it seems outwardly least applicable at the beginning of a book in which virtually no one is named a book in which identities are indicated only in the riddling fashion of Dante's Him Who Made the Great Refusal, that was, in practical terms, very unwise. Between friends who still saw one another every day, such a thing might have worked out. But laughing up your sleeve at someone else's joke when other people think that the joke is on you requires a very steadfast trust, and steadfastness was not Schelling's most notable virtue. Hegel put Schelling in the awkward situation of having to choose between the author of the Phenomenology and the whole school of schematizing formalists as the true friends of the absolute identity system. Schelling chose fairly soon to ignore the distinction that Hegel wanted to make and to take his stand among those whom Hegel really was laughing at. For it will not do, when we come to the question of whom Hegel really is laughing at, it will not do simply to identify Reinhold and Bardili's reduction of philosophy to logic as the naivete of the void in cognition, and let it go at that. It was indeed Reinhold's Urwahre, his original truth, that was the first night in which all the cows are black. But that is only the beginning, not the end of the story. It's not that older enemy of the absolute identity system that Hegel's sights are set upon. It is the formalism reborn within the more recent philosophy that decries and despises it. That's what he's really concerned with. As we have seen, this reborn formalism comes in two logical shapes. There is a perfectly monochrome form of it and a bichromatic form. If we now look more closely at his two discussions of formalism, we shall see that among the essentially nameless cows that are lost in the dark night, at least 4 logical varieties are present. What makes them logically distinguishable is how they use the two colors that Kant's dualism of pure and practical reason gave them. Kant himself is not one of the lost cows. He used and perfected the logic of formal identity, the logic out of which Reinhold made the first dark night. But Kant's work was done before that night fell. And since the germ of true speculative insight is present in his triplicity, he can still be seen and named. But after Reinhold, the night engulfs first those who paint only landscapes, i.e., they do only natural philosophy with Reinhold's identity principle, then those who transcend the duality of the two-color palette altogether. I'm simply identifying the parties in the order in which they occur in Hegel's discourse and not in any logical order. The night engulfs first those who paint only landscapes, they do only natural philosophy, then those who transcend the duality of the two-color palette altogether, that's to say they abandon reason and science altogether, even in the Kantian formal sense, and give themselves up to religious mysticism. Then Fichte, who uses only red for the endless history of the finite spirit, and finally the unidentified author of the Sun-Clear Report upon the Organism of the Universe. For surely he should be as determinate as Fichte, the author of the Sun-Clear Report that was actually written under that name. He needs his two colors separately. He is a true scientist in the Kantian tradition, but he never uses more than one color at a time. So his Sun-Clear Report brings only a ticketed skeleton to light. The living organic universum remains as dark as ever. Now, I have not myself read any of the formalist enemies to which the more recent philosophy has given birth, except Fichte, whom even Hegel does not allow to be lost to sight. So I can only offer surmises based upon Hegel's private notes and on the work of others who have read more widely than I have, especially Messrs. Bonsiepen and Haider, the editors of the Phenomenology and the Critical Edition. But I must show where the presence of these four at least partially distinguishable categories is detectable in Hegel's texts, and as I do that, I will try, in defiance of Virgil's command, to name some representatives of each group. For although it was contrary to the spirit of science for Hegel to name them in life, I take it to be in accordance with the spirit of that same science as a reminiscent lingering that we should try to name them now in death. First then, let us take the new natural philosophers, pure and simple, the ones whom I think Hegel takes first. They are the direct occasion for Hegel's first attack on formalism in general, and the reason for his evocation of the logical identity principle of Reinhold and Bardili, that simple A equals A identity of the understanding, which is what he calls the dark night in which all the cows are black. What Hegel says about those others who silence the opposition by their Ungestum is not very specific. It'll be back in paragraph 14 or 15 in Ansehung des Inhalts.
Yeah. Per quel che riguarda il contenuto, gli altri ricorrono talvolta a un metodo molto sbrigativo per disporre di una grande estensione. Essi traggono sul loro terreno una gran quantità di materiale, vale a dire tutto ciò che è già noto e già ordinato, e mentre si adoperano più che altro intorno a stranezze e a curiosità, hanno l'aria di possedere tutto il rimanente, riguardo a cui il sapere a suo modo aveva già esaurito il suo compito, e di dominare ciò che non è ancora ordinato, assoggettando così ogni cosa all'assoluta idea, la quale per tale via sembra venire perfettamente conosciuta ed essere prosperata a dispiegata scienza.
This blustering use of a mass of ill-assorted empirical data is just what Hegel seems to ascribe to Joseph Goeritz and Johann Jakob Wagner in his Waste book. Here, you haven't got that here, no. I'll give you my summary of what he says in English. Just as there has been a genius period in poetry, so nowadays there seems to be the philosophical genius period. We mix up carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, and we add poles, and out of all this we get the Empyrean. Thus, Goeritz, Wagner, and others, the crudest empiricism with a formalism of stuffs and poles, mixed with completely reasonless analogies and drunken thought, drunken strokes of lightning in thought. That's what Hegel says about Goeritz and Wagner and such like people in the Waste book, and it seems to me to tie up with that passage that Ricardo just read in the Phenomenology. So there are some names for that group. Next in order come those who transcend science altogether, and the prince of these we can identify from the notes to the preface. because there is a running polemic all through the preface against God's own to whom he gives wisdom in sleep, the dreamers. In this connection, Bonsiepen and Hede point the finger directly at C.A. Eschenmeyer's Talks upon the Holy and History, entitled Der Eremit und der Fremdling, published at Erlangen in 1805. So it's immediately current when Hegel is writing the preface. In view of Eschenmeyer's close association with Schelling's philosophy of nature from the time of its first inception, Schelling took the language of Potenzen from Eschenmeyer. In view of Eschenmeyer's close association with Schelling's philosophy of nature, I have no doubt that among the supposed friends of the speculative principle of identity, Eschenmeyer is the leading representative of the group who are attacked for replacing logical scientific method altogether through the unmethod of Anden, intuiting in, I'm not sure what's the best word.
Andong è una cosa giuridica. Metodo del
No, I think it's
congetturare o qualcosa.
The unmethod, the non-method of
sì, deve andare a tentoni.
What's the word? Oh damn, I can't remember. And of despise that scientific method of empirical science, but all scientific method. So, Hegel is thinking of others as well as the supposed disciples of the identity philosophy here. Jacobi is the most obvious and most prominent of them, but among the reborn formalists, there is at least one extremist who has made himself into the absolute painter, whose manner Hegel describes as
what should it be?
It's in that passage you read earlier. In 51. Das sich diese Manier zugleich zur einfärbigen absoluten Malerei vollendet.
Ah sì, l'abbiamo già letto.
Sì.
Che ci è già soprannotato che questa maniera di conoscenza finisce in una pittura assolutamente monocromatica. Essa maniera infatti, scandalizzata dalle differenze dello schema, le affonda perché appartenente alla riflessione nella vutagine dell'assoluto, in modo che poi ne viene fuori la pura diversità, il bianco senza forma.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't remembered that the absolute color was white. But yes, of course. Hegel seems to be adopting Newton's theory of colors in this, and of course that's quite appropriate. Eschenmeyer is my favorite candidate for this distinction of achieving the ultimate indistinctness. And if I'm right, then it is Eschenmeyer who has regenerated the empty identity of Reinhold and Bardili in the new speculative philosophy. He it is, then, who has given out the absolute of the new speculative philosophy as the dark night in which all the cows are black. But it must be conceded that Joseph Goeres belongs to this party of the religious prophets too. My ideal categories, therefore, are not really distinct, and the cows truly are all black, because Harris, you see, is one of the empiricists who's condemned earlier for his interest in oddities and curiosities. The painter who paints historical pieces all in red is Fichte, the author of the Sun-Clear Report. He has, to all intents and purposes, no speculative, organic philosophy of nature at all. But his just published Anweisung zum seligen Leben is a good example of the absolute painting in which all distinctions are lost in the light which John Paul rightly called the darkness of him who is born blind. All of the religious enthusiasts in the new speculative movement take their cue from Fichte as much as they do from Jacobi. Finally, then, there is the author of the Sun-Clear Report on the Universe as an Organism. He may not be one person at all, of course. Perhaps Hegel wants us to think of the whole group of Schelling's false friends and imitators decorating their dead skeleton of the universal organism with its labels. But that's not really an appropriate image for the new genius period in philosophy. The geniuses steal from the works of others, and particularly from Schelling, but they cannot collaborate. So the Sun-Clear Report of the Organic Philosophy ought to have its singular genius author. I think that he is Heinrich Steffens, whose Grundzüge der philosophischen Naturwissenschaft, just published in 1806, was the principal topic of discussion between Hegel and Goethe when they met in the Frohman household at the end of August in that year. Steffens was a great maker of tables of natural phenomena, which were supposedly analogous with one another at the different levels of the logical evolution of nature. Von Siepen and Haider tell us that Steffens had parallel series of organic, chemical and geological phenomena, and we can all of us read how Hegel criticized Steffens' theory that the metals form a natural series, a logical series, in the earliest version of Hegel's own Naturphilosophie that has survived. It does not matter to my hypothesis that I do not know whether Steffens ever extended his analogical method into the spiritual realm. Fichte himself has provided the Sun-Clear Report of that. The monochrome master of the universe as an organism has simply completed Fichte's work appropriately in accordance with the antinomy established by Kant. This anonymous author can be thought of as the bichromatic master because he simply presupposes Fichte. He works on the canvas that Fichte has left. The true development of science as it first begins, the development of it in the phenomenology, must reintegrate Fichte's monochrome spiritualism with the philosophy of nature in a methodically creative way, as distinct from the way it's done in the Sun-Clear Report on the Universe as an Organism. Hegel himself, we may note, offers us the medical theory of John Brown as the clearest example of schematic formalism. But I've left Brown out because he is pre-Kantian. But of course, I have to admit that it may be one or more of Schelling's medical hangers-on who was the proposed author of the fictional organic report. The answer to the question doesn't really matter. I support Steffens because even if his organic report is only a monochrome landscape, confined strictly to the sphere of the philosophy of nature proper, Steffens seems clearly to be the best of the bunch, and Hegel does take account of his scientific theory, specifically in Chapter 5 of his Science of Experience. Goerres, or J.J. Wagner, who may, for all I know, fit the bichromatic bill just as well or better, are cows who can go on grazing in the darkness as far as I'm concerned. But Stephens, I think, deserves to be remembered precisely because he was a scientist of note and not just a romantic religious enthusiast.
You are overvaluing him.
Am I?
You are overvaluing him.
Okay. There can be no doubt that Hegel's Vorrede did cause a permanent breach with Schelling. It was the only part of the book that Schelling had read when he acknowledged receipt of the phenomenology 6 months after it was sent. And possibly, at least, it is as much of the book as he ever did. I should take that sentence out. It was the only part of the book that Schelling had read when he acknowledged receipt of the phenomenology 6 months after it was sent. I've only tried to show here that the preface was not meant to cause a breach. There's no doubt that it did cause a breach. I've only tried to show that it wasn't meant to cause a breach, and that, on the contrary, the book itself was intended to supply the methodical approach to the theory of speculative identity that Schelling's school actually needed, and most of all Schelling himself actually needed. Hegel was not writing hypocritical letters to Schelling expressing a friendly interest in his latest writings about natural philosophy and his newest journal, while at the same time tunneling to plant a mine under the whole enterprise. All the same, Hegel did here attack virtually every other ally that Schelling had. It's not surprising that Schelling rapidly decided that with friends like Hegel he hardly needed enemies. Schelling proved to be a good hater, and it's easy for us to sympathize with Hegel's puzzled reaction and continued willingness to be friends again. But if we think of Stephens when we read Hegel's renewed diatribe against the whole school at Berlin, we shall know that Schelling was not altogether wrong. I'm sorry to hear that.
Shall I summarize?
We don't need this, I think.
No, I can.
All right, if you wish.
Ma senza dubbio, senza esitazione si può accettare per corretta che la filosofia della natura oggi giace sotto un giudizio particolarmente sfavorevole, che è caduta in significativo discredito. Non voglio parlarne troppo a lungo, non voglio soffermarmi troppo sul modo, sulla misura in cui questo pregiudizio contro la filosofia della natura è giusto, è giustificato. Però non sono in grado neanche di saltarlo del tutto, di non parlarne. È successo. Sì, infatti è successo ciò che di solito non fa eccezione, ciò che di solito capita quando ci sono delle grosse, c'è una grande citazione, e cioè che l'idea della filosofia della natura, come si è presentata di recente, nei tempi moderni, è stata, si potrebbe dire, è stata presa da mani rozze e non abili, si potrebbe dire nella prima soddisfazione che questa scoperta ha concesso. Qui si parla evidentemente della filosofia naturale del 600, del 500. Invece anziché essere curata dalla ragione pensante e nemmeno che sarebbe stato anche auspicabile, nemmeno sia stata geschlagen, ripudiata, Breitenplatte, senza tanti complimenti dai suoi oppositori o dai suoi amici. Questa filosofia della natura è stata trasformata in diverse forme, però la maggior parte di queste in un formalismo esteriore e in uno strumento privo di concetti per la piattezza, per la superficialità del pensiero e per una immaginazione fantasiosa. È stata corrotta, per Vandel trasformata e corrotta. Io non voglio caratterizzare più da vicino la cialtroneria, sono parole così in libertà, in cui è stata per le quali si è fatto uso dell'idea, ovvero delle forme rese morte di questa filosofia della natura. Molto tempo fa ho detto di più nella mia prefazione alla filologia dello spirito, e all'epoca non è stato da stupirsi che sia le più fini o le più sensibili intuizioni della natura, come anche il rozzo empirismo, abbiano volto le spalle sia all'idea di un conoscere così introdotto in questo modo, sia nella forma di un intelletto estrinseco e astratto, e alle sue ai suoi tentativi, che erano altrettanto barocchi quanto pretenziosi, che addirittura perfino il rozzo empirismo, come forme del pensiero non comprese, come pieno arbitrio dell'immaginazione, e in quanto la forma più comune, più semplice di procedere per superficiali analogie, è stato mischiato caoticamente e ha spacciato questo Gebräu è una brodaglia, questo è veramente la birra prima di diventare birra, per questa brodaglia, come se fosse l'idea, la ragione, la scienza, come se fosse sapere divino, e ha spacciato questa mancanza di ogni metodo di scientificità come se fosse la vetta suprema della stessa scientificità. Attraverso simili Schwindelein il parlare instabile di uno che oscilla, no? Schwindel sia un malato di epilessia, come il morbo di San Valentino, quelli che cadono. No, Schwindelein è un parlare bizzarro, insomma, che non sta in piedi, è una cosa che anziché camminare stando bene continua a oscillare. Allora, queste bizzarrie, la filosofia della natura, e specialmente la filosofia della natura di Schelling, è caduta in discredito.
As we can see now, even this attack in the Berlin lectures was still not directed at Schelling himself, for Hegel has still not forgotten how much he owes to Schelling. But here again, he asks Schelling to forsake all others and cleave only to his one true follower. And whatever the poet may think, that's Shakespeare, the impediments to this marriage of true minds are very real. When I began this paper, I was concerned only with the passage in the preface to the Phenomenology, because it was necessary for me to get rid of the idea that Hegel was attacking Schelling if the Phenomenology is really an introduction to an absolute philosophy that Hegel shares with Schelling. But I was interested to discover, when I went back to the Berlin lectures at the end, that Hegel is referring back to the preface to the Phenomenology and still making the same distinction. And this explains, you see, how it is that in 1829, when they happen to meet at Karlsbad, Hegel wants to be friends and thinks they can be friends, and thinks even that after 2 days' conversation, friendship has been restored. And he writes all this to his wife, while Schelling is writing to his wife how utterly shocked and amazed and bewildered he is that this man Hegel should even think such a thing could be possible.
Esatto. E poi alla fine Schelling ha parlato malissimo di Hegel, no? Dopo che Hegel era morto. L'ha preso in giro sotto tutti i punti di vista. Nelle lezioni. Ma poi anche raccontando aneddoti che adesso sono andati perduti. Ad esempio, Schelling faceva lezioni a Monaco nell'835, 5 anni dopo la morte di Hegel, e allora raccontava ai suoi studenti di come erano a Jena lui e Hegel, e praticamente diceva sì, Hegel nel 1801 ha insegnato logica perché non sapeva fare di meglio, oppure perché dei suoi amici più saggi di lui gli hanno detto di fare così. Insomma, lo faceva di tutto per screditarlo. E così
I think I've already heard this lecture, and it was in Berlin last year.
That's right. It was written. That's why this essay was written for the Congress in Berlin last year. That is why the quotations are all in German.
Yes, the quotations are all in German, and they were amazing the public, because they're very amusing. Some of them. Sì, no, in Italia era stato Cesa che ha provato. Sapete che Cesa è specialista di Schelling che di Hegel, ma prima Schelling e poi Hegel. E allora la domanda che poneva Cesa era: ma Hegel ha veramente voluto avere una rottura con Schelling scrivendo la fenomenologia dello spirito? E Cesa aveva provato, come il professor Harris adesso, a ricostruire il contesto di questa lettera, perché bisogna leggere bene, no? C'è il passo del quindicesimo capoverso della fenomenologia dello spirito, che è chiaro, però poi ci sono le lettere e ci sono le testimonianze e si riesce un po' a ricostruire. Allora Cesa aveva detto che in fondo Hegel non voleva assolutamente offendere Schelling e aveva scritto la prefazione semmai come doveroso atto di amicizia. E il professore dice che se non voleva offendere Schelling, però doveva essere senz'altro più cauto, cioè era stato un rischio deliberato. E da quel momento gli studi sono andati però abbastanza a rilento, perché sia sul problema, ma ci sono tre momenti per i quali il problema Schelling-Hegel è grave, è discusso. Il primo riguarda älteste Systemprogramm, cioè quello scritto del 1695, che è stato scritto materialmente da Hegel perché è la sua calligrafia, però non si sa se l'autore del programma sia Hegel, Schelling o Hölderlin. E qua ci sono tre partiti, no? Dove ovviamente gli hegeliani dicono che è stato Hegel, gli schellingiani dicono che è stato Schelling e gli hölderliniani dicono che è stato Hölderlin. Questo è veramente poco edificante. Però ad esempio Pöggeler dice che è stato Hegel, Siliet dice che è stato Schelling, e poi Rosenzweig e Betzendorf e quegli altri dicono che è stato Hölderlin. Però Hölderlin non si sa bene, ma Hegel e Schelling si è fatto molto discutere. Il secondo punto è questo della fenomenologia, e il terzo è un articolo apparso nel 1802 sul Kritisches Journal für Philosophie, che si chiama Über das Verhältnis der Naturphilosophie zur Wissenschaft zur Philosophie überhaupt, che è un altro articolo che poi lì è stato il primo punto che ha fatto la confusione. Nel 1830 era già Michelet e c'era Schelling, nel 1830-35 c'era Schelling che diceva quell'articolo l'ho scritto io, Hegel non ha scritto niente. Invece Michelet, che era allievo di Hegel, ha detto no, quell'articolo l'ha scritto Hegel, e allora poi lì è nata una discussione abbastanza sterile. In sostanza non so fino a che punto siete arrivati voi con la... Non so se siete convinti, se vi occupate di questa cosa. È difficile convincersi di chi fosse veramente l'autore o che cosa volesse dire Hegel veramente qua. Se posso dare il mio parere spassionato, è che non è facile controllare. Ad esempio il professor Harris questo l'ha detto molto bene nel libro Knives Hawks, che parla di Hegel e Schelling a Jena. In sostanza, se scrivevano tutti e due, era probabile succedesse questo, che Hegel, che era più anziano, perché aveva 5 anni di più Hegel, però dal punto di vista accademico e anche finanziario era quello più malmesso, e quindi Hegel ha tutto da guadagnare a che queste riviste o questi scritti uscissero, mentre Schelling poteva anche farne a meno. Quindi è da pensare che Hegel abbia fatto più lavoro di Schelling, e allora l'ipotesi che faceva il professor Harris era che Hegel deve aver scritto lui tutto quanto l'articolo, e sono due gli articoli in questione, quello über das Verhältnis der Naturphilosophie überhaupt, che è un articolo così, e quell'altro che invece è più interessante secondo me è quello über das Wesen der philosophischen Kritik, sull'essenza critica filosofica, che è l'editoriale in cui si apre la rivista. Secondo Harris, e penso sia giusto, Hegel deve aver scritto lui tutto quanto, poi l'ha dato a Schelling, e Schelling ha cancellato, ha aggiunto, immaginatevi su un foglio di 18 pagine, Hegel aveva scritto tutte e 18, poi Schelling legge, cambia, toglie la numero 3 e la numero 4, la riscrive, la rimette dentro, rilegge tutto bene, e poi Hegel di nuovo lo legge di nuovo, legge le correzioni di Schelling, le accetta, cambia un po' anche lui, però in sostanza deve essere stato così. È probabile, proprio perché Schelling non aveva tempo. Schelling pubblicava mille altre cose e aveva molti più impegni di Hegel. Invece Hegel faceva solo quello, no? Quindi è da pensare che e da questo punto di vista in effetti chi ha lavorato di più è stato Hegel, no? Cioè, chi ha raccolto i materiali, chi ha preparato tutto è stato Hegel, e Schelling ha messo solo le cose lì. Però è ovvio che se le tesi principali, le tesi che modificano, le definizioni e tutto le ha messe Schelling, è inutile dire che Hegel è l'autore assoluto, no? E quindi questo per quanto riguarda i due articoli controversi. Per quanto riguarda il Law Ethics System Program, io sono convinto che è di Schelling, anche se sono hegeliano, perché Hegel non poteva dire delle cose così strambe sulla mitologia della ragione, sui sacerdoti della luce o qualcosa che dice, deve essere senz'altro di un altro. Però anche lì è una cosa concordata, perché non so se voi conoscete questo scritto di cioè un foglio e il retro, non sono arrivati, e quello lì è una cosa concordata, perché qui Henry aveva molto ragione, cioè perché hanno scritto quella roba i tre amici Schelling, Hegel e Oeberlin? L'hanno scritta perché dovevano mandarla a qualcuno. E chi era qualcuno? Qualcuno erano gli allievi più vecchi di 10 anni di loro, più non di 10, di 7-8 anni di Hegel, che a Tubinga dovevano opporsi a Flatt, a Storr, a Abel, quella gente lì. Allora, come comunicato interno di una organizzazione rivoluzionaria, come volantino, e a quel punto lì, anche lì, non so se voi avete mai scritto volantini in gioventù, però ci si trovava tutti assieme e si scriveva il volantino, no? Ecco, e anche lì direi che dire che per forza è stato Hegel è estremamente ridicolo. E per quel che riguarda la prefazione alla fenomenologia, anche lì io non farei tanta dietrologia come è stata fatta, ma semplicemente direi che Hegel aveva scritto il libro, Hegel a Bamberga era assolutamente disperato, sapete che ha pubblicato la prefazione, l'ha scritta quando aveva lasciato Jena ed era a Bamberga direttore di giornale, e si trovava in una situazione di isolamento assoluto. Aveva avuto casa saccheggiata, per dire così. L'ultima cosa che gli interessava era, credo, che cosa 200 anni dopo la gente avrebbe detto di quelle due parole che lui ha scritto su Schelling. Semplicemente le ha scritte perché non ne contava le conseguenze, no? Si sentiva anche, questo l'ha detto anche Cesa bene, nel 6 Hegel capisce che il suo rapporto con Schelling era mai esaurito. Semplicemente, anche qui non sono ragioni teoriche, semplicemente perché Schelling aveva accolto la chiamata a Würzburg, quindi Würzburg era lontana centinaia e centinaia di chilometri, lui era fuori, lui era sì vicino a Würzburg perché era a Bamberga, però erano tutti e due lontani da Jena, e Hegel era abilitato a leggere solo a Jena, non nelle altre università, e quindi di fronte a questa situazione di assoluto isolamento è probabile che abbiano detto scriviamola così. Ma poi dovete anche pensare come erano i manoscritti all'epoca, cioè erano dei fogli tagliati in quarto, no? e scritti abbastanza largo, e poi insomma non ci voleva niente a mettere una frase in più, venivano dati manoscritti all'editore, e chi secondo me non deve averci pensato tantissimo.
You go too fast.
Oh, sorry. Però se voi anche avete pensato su queste cose, un'altra cosa volevo dire, il professore ha citato il Waste Book, dove parlava di Goebbels e di Wagner, e parlava di un problema che c'era allora, ed era i 4 elementi chimici, volevo dire Kohlenstoff e carbonio, Sauerstoff idrogeno, Stickstoff azoto e Wasserstoff ho sbagliato, Sauerstoff ossigeno e Wasserstoff idrogeno. I 4 sono questi qui, no? Di cui 3 semplici e uno del carbonio che poi fa il composto. E la teoria che si discuteva allora era se fosse possibile rinunciare, cioè se fosse possibile ridurre tutti gli elementi semplici al carbonio. Ovviamente una teoria sbagliata, ma che si lascia spiegare col vitalismo che c'era allora. Siccome il carbonio è il principio che dà origine alle sostanze organiche, Allora questo era già un motivo sufficiente per assegnargli un ruolo privilegiato e superiore. Naturalmente non c'è riuscito nessuno, però questo Steffens, che il professore ha citato dopo, era uno dei sostenitori di questa teoria. Aveva fatto una scala dei metalli, Steffens, ed era tutto molto sbagliato comunque. Questo. Non so, queste cose sono spiegate molto bene nelle note che ha fatto Horstmann e Klaus Güsing al volume 6 delle Gesamte Schriften. Lì ci sono delle note di chimica e sono anche i riferimenti che il professore ha fatto a John Brown, a Steffens, a Görres, ci sono tutti lì, e se li andate a vedere sono bellissimi. Meno buone sono quelle al volume 7 che ha fatto Horstmann e Trede, e al volume 8 anche non sono tanto buone, le note di commento. Probabilmente Horstmann è diventato pigro, è vero, perché se avesse cercato avrebbe trovato. Avete questioni sull'interpretazione? E invece Bonsipen e Hegel non hanno trovato niente, scandaloso. Avrebbero fatto veramente una ricerca di fonti della fenomenologia, sarebbe stato ben di più di quello che hanno trovato.
Of course, it's part of the policy, isn't it, to be very cautious about the notes added to the printed works.
Yes, of course, but it is ridiculous what I found.
Certainly they could have done more, I'm quite sure of that.
I'm sure they can't do more because they haven't not read the books.
Well, they've done the preface more or less right. They more or less seriously. They've read the books for the preface.
Sapete, questa è la nuova edizione della Fenomenologia dello Spirito. Anche lì è difficile dire. C'è una buona edizione della Fenomenologia dello Spirito che ha fatto Hofmeister nel 30 circa, e quella dal punto di vista tedesco e apparizioni in paragrafi, così, quella che ha Fies. E De Negri ha preso Hofmeister come edizione, che è una buona cosa. E poi Hippolyte, per il suo commentario, ha preso Hofmeister e De Negri. Importante, mediazione De Negri importante per Hippolyte. E poi hanno rifatto questa edizione per il Gesamte Schriften e l'hanno rifatta e hanno messo tutte le virgole e tutta l'ortografia come l'aveva Hegel, e quella sarebbe stata una buona occasione per mettere delle solide note a piedi pagina, e invece hanno messo delle robe ridicole. Peccato.
Una questione di crescendo un po' questo materiale, lo define it, scusi. I want to talk about Eschenmeier. There's a clear reference to Eschenmeier also in the 3rd chapter of Verstand.
I didn't. Oh, is that where the holy? Yes, the holy, das Heilig.
The critical edition refers also to Eschenmeier. And now my question is, it is very probable that Hegel thinks of Eschenmeier, but the philosophical importance of the reference to Das Heilige und Das Leben, I think, transcends that far. I also hear very much a critic of Kant's philosophy of the Ding an sich, an implicit religious standpoint, as far as that goes.
I think, yes, that seems to be confirmed by the role that I have analyzed for Kant in the preface. Kant is the source of all this schematizing, and our knowledge is a schema of the Ding of this mysterious Ding an sich, which I think becomes, if I may add a British note here, which I think in time becomes Bradley's absolute. Bradley is a kind of Eschenmeier who takes over all the detail of the Hegelian view and imports it into Kant's final definition of the Ding an sich in the Critique of Pure Reason. If you look at the more or less the last discussion of the Ding an sich in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you can see that the Kantian Ding an sich really is God in Kant's own mind, and that is, I think, what Eschenmayer and others, mainly inspired by Jacobi, as far as I can see, are taking up. And one can take all the new philosophy of nature and absorb it into a doctrine of the absolute identity, which really is just the Ding an sich returned. I forget whether it was the Kant essay or the Fichte essay where I said that it seems to me that the absolute identity is the Ding an sich, the last, what we might call the last shape of the Ding an sich. The phenomenology is an attempt to overcome that remnant, that last remnant of Kantianism in this new speculative idealism. Yes. See?
Has Schelling ever explicitly commented on how it feels to be involved in this in Hegel's project? Hegel assigns Schelling's thought a certain how it feels from the man who is concerned.
Well, I'm not an expert on all the things that the old Schelling said after Hegel died, but in general, it's probable that the reports of that first lecture on the history of philosophy at Jena and the reports that we have show what kind of reports Schelling would have got. The students were amazed because Hegel presented the whole series of philosophical views and showed how each of them went to its death, so to speak. And there comes, as last in the series, Schelling, and he goes to his death too. And the absolute philosophy is something beyond Schelling. This created a great stir and a tremendous furor at the time. I mean, of course, there was also the remark that Schelling had conducted his education in public. He published one system after another, a new one every year, so to speak. But that was probably less shocking than the suggestion that there was something greater and better than the best that Schelling had produced. So it's probable that first course on the history of philosophy was the beginning of was the foundation, as it were, for the kind of negative interpretation that Schelling was bound to put on the polemic in the preface to the Phenomenology. Schelling's reaction to it, of course, was always to maintain that Hegel is a plagiarist. He's just stolen my ideas. The whole school lives by eating my bread, he said in 1841. But all the details of his criticisms, I'm afraid I haven't studied.